She stood between them in perfect stillness, two uniformed officers on either side laughing softly, their smug grins aimed not just at the gallery but at her. One gave a quick high five to the other, their fingertips cracking through the tents, air like punctuation at the end of a cruel joke. The courtroom murmured with quiet approval, a low rumble of nods and smirks from people who thought they'd just witnessed another routine win. But Camille Hayes didn't move. Her hands folded in front of her, her expression unreadable, her gaze steady and unflinching. She let the celebration happen. Let the air fill with arrogance. Let them believe they'd won. Because she knew what? They didn't. She wasn't a spectator. She wasn't a lawyer. She wasn't just another woman in a suit. And when the room finally settled into a hush, she raised her chin and said, clearly, calmly, "Before we continue, you should know, I'm your new Chief of Internal Affairs." The words struck like a gavel before the judge could lift a hand. The laughter died. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of everything they failed to see. "Tell us where you're watching from. And stay close." What happens next changes everything. The courtroom was dressed in tradition, polished mahogany benches, solemn portraits, and the rustle of suits too stiff to breathe. It looked like justice, but Camille Hayes knew better. She sat at the plaintiff's table, calm and composed, her tailored ivory suit blending into the background of legal decorum. To most in the room, she was just another attorney, perhaps an assistant to the prosecutor. No one noticed the sharpness in her eyes, the quiet way she observed, not just the testimony, but every smirk, every sideways glance, every suppressed chuckle from the defense bench. At 40, Camille had climbed, past ceilings designed to block her, arriving weeks ago as the newly appointed Chief of Internal Affairs. But she wasn't here today for applause. She was here to watch, to learn, to listen to what wasn't being said out loud. Across the aisle sat Officers Brad Keller and Jake Monroe, mid-30s, smug and confident, wearing their uniforms like armor and their arrogance like a second badge. They'd testified with charm, with laughs, with the kind of certainty that comes from never having been questioned. To them, Camille was invisible. They'd made that clear from the moment she walked in, whispering to each other and pointing at her as if she didn't understand the weight of a courtroom. Jake had even turned to Brad and muttered under his breath, "She looks like HR or something." They chuckled. Camille wrote it down. She'd been watching this case unfold for weeks. Not just the facts, but the conduct, the language, the body language. What interested her most wasn't the verdict. It was the culture. The silent rules, the unspoken bias, the way some officers handled power like a toy and treated dignity like a reward. The courtroom was their stage, and they were performing for the gallery. But Camille had seen this play before, and she knew exactly when to flip the script. As the final witness stepped down and the judge prepared to announce a ruling, Camille quietly straightened her notes, slid her phone from her briefcase, and texted her assistant 2 words: "Let them finish." Her hands were steady, her face unreadable, because she wasn't here to stop the show. She was here to end it, for good. Officer Brad Keller leaned back in the witness chair with a swagger that didn't belong in a courtroom. His tone was polished but slippery, every word carefully chosen to sound legitimate while quietly distorting the truth. "We followed procedure," he said, looking directly at the jury, his eyes rehearsed. "We gave the suspect multiple warnings. What happened after that was unfortunate but justified." His partner, Officer Jake Monroe, sat a few feet away, arms crossed and lips curled in a smug smile, nodding as if confirming every word through body language alone. During cross-examination, their confidence only grew. They smirked at the opposing counsel, scoffed at the idea of overreach, and even managed to crack a joke that drew scattered laughs from the gallery. But Camille Hayes didn't laugh. She didn't even blink. She sat motionless at the plaintiff's table, her hands resting calmly on a closed leather folder. They hadn't acknowledged her once. Not when she walked in, not when she leaned in to whisper to the lead attorney, not when she subtly corrected a document mid-proceeding. To them, she was invisible, a paper pusher, maybe someone from legal, maybe someone temporary, certainly not someone who mattered. Camille let them keep believing that. She wanted to see how deep the rot went. As the defense wrapped up, Brad returned to the stand with an unnecessary flourish. "I think we can all agree," he said with exaggerated humility, "that the officers involved acted in good faith. We've served our city with honor. Always have." Jake leaned over and whispered loud enough for Camille to hear. "If she ever makes it into our department, she won't last a day." He chuckled. So did a few others. The judge didn't admonish him. The bailiff didn't blink. Camille sat still, her face unreadable. She didn't speak. Not yet, but her fingers moved slowly over her legal pad. She wrote something in calm, measured strokes, tore the sheet gently, folded it once, then slid it into her folder. The gesture was so subtle that it barely caught the eye, but it marked a turning point. The courtroom didn't know it yet, but the rules were about to change. Camille closed the folder, placed her hands on the table, and finally lifted her eyes. They weren't angry. They were ready. As the final arguments wound down and the judge glanced at the clock, she adjusted her glasses and looked over the courtroom. "Is there anything further before we proceed to the verdict?" she asked, her voice crisp. The room settled into that familiar anticipatory hush, the kind that usually signaled the end of something. But not this time. From the plaintiff's table, Camille Hayes stood slowly, her motion graceful, deliberate. The courtroom's attention shifted toward her, though a few still assumed she was a paralegal delivering papers. She walked with measured steps toward the front, her heels clicking softly against the hardwood floor, each one quieter than the growing heartbeat of the room. People expected her to speak, a closing statement maybe, some final defense of the victim whose case had just been brushed aside. But Camille didn't begin with words. She reached into her blazer and pulled out a leather badge wallet. With a calm flick of her hand, she opened it and held it up for the court to see. Gasps rippled through the room like a crack of thunder masked behind manners. "Before this court issues a verdict," she said, her voice smooth but steely, "there's something the department should know." The silence that followed wasn't just quiet, it was stunned. You could hear breathing change, shifting in. Chairs. A pen clattered in the gallery as someone fumbled to pick it up. Camille lowered the badge slowly, then fixed her gaze directly on Officers Brad Keller and Jake Monroe. "I'm Camille Hayes," she said, "Chief of Internal Affairs. And this wasn't just a case. It was a test of culture, of conduct, of character." The color drained from Brad's face like ink washed from a page. Jake opened his mouth slightly, then closed it again, his smirk evaporating as if it had never existed. Neither spoke, neither moved. For the first time all day, they had nothing to say. Camille took another step forward, her voice still soft but now unmistakably in control. "I've been observing this case, not for the facts alone, but for how officers carry themselves under pressure, for how they respond when the courtroom isn't watching closely. But people are listening. I watched testimony turned into theater. I watched justice reduced to bravado. And I waited. I waited for a moment of integrity. It never came." The UOM judge leaned back slightly, unsure whether to interrupt or surrender. The gallery was stone still, the earlier chuckles now a distant, shameful echo. Brad's hand twitched on the table in front of him, like he wanted to do something, say something. But no words came. Camille turned to the judge, her expression still unreadable. "Your Honor, I request the court accept new material evidence, internal, findings reviewed by my office over the past 3 weeks. They include misconduct reports, unfiled complaints, and transcripts of prior cases involving both officers." She handed a sealed file to the bailiff, who took it as if it were radioactive. Then she stepped back, her eyes scanning the crowd, pausing, briefly on the familiar faces who had looked through her earlier, on the officers who had smirked from the gallery, on the woman in the third row who had whispered, "She's probably just observing." Camille didn't need to say anything more. Her badge said it all. The verdict hadn't yet been spoken. But the truth had, and that was louder than anything this courtroom had heard in years. Camille let the silence stretch, giving the weight of her presence time to settle. Every gaze in the courtroom was now fixed on her, not with dismissal, but with dawning comprehension. She stepped slightly closer to the bench, her voice calm and resolute as she began, "For the past month I've been attending hearings like this, not as a name on the department roster, but as an invisible observer. I wasn't just here to watch this case, I was here to watch you." Her tone didn't waver, but the truth it carried struck like a hammer cloaked in silk. "The real investigation," she continued, "wasn't about the suspect in this file. It was about how you carried yourselves through it, what you did when you thought no one was watching, what kind of power you chose to wield when you believed there'd be no consequences." As Camille spoke, an assistant walked briskly toward the judge's bench and placed a thick envelope in the bailiff's hands, its seal marked with the Internal Affairs insignia. "Inside," Camille said, gesturing toward the file, "are witness statements, transcripts, body cam redactions that never made it into court, and evidence of intimidation tactics, conduct that undermines public trust and disrespects the very badge you wear." She didn't have to look at Brad or Jake. They were already staring at the floor, their shoulders sinking beneath the weight of exposure. Their smirks had dissolved. Their armor had cracked. The courtroom that had once chuckled at their offhand remarks now sat frozen, every listener caught in the shift of atmosphere. The oak-paneled walls, once symbols of order, now seemed to echo with the discomfort of truths long buried. Camille turned slowly, facing the audience, not to scold, but to reveal. "Leadership," she said, her voice quiet but clear, "isn't about volume. It's about vigilance. It's not measured in rank or years of service, but in the courage to do what's right, when no one is clapping for you, when it's inconvenient, when it's hard." She let that hang in the air like a final verdict. The courtroom remained still. No murmurs, no shifting chairs, no smug glances. Just the sound of truth finally taking its rightful place. In that moment, Camille didn't just expose misconduct. She dismantled a culture that had been protected by silence, and in doing so, she reclaimed the room, not with rage, but with reason. And that was the kind of justice that echoed far beyond the walls. The courtroom, once crackling with arrogance and false confidence, had fallen into stunned stillness. The judge, eyes now narrowed with the weight of what she'd just read, straightened in her seat and glanced toward the two officers who had, only an hour before, treated the room like their stage. "This court will not proceed to verdict," she announced, her tone steely. "The case is hereby reopened under the direct oversight of Internal Affairs. Officers Keller and Monroe, effective immediately, you are suspended pending full investigation." A collective breath was held as the courtroom shifted from spectacle to consequence. Camille didn't gloat. She didn't smile. She stepped forward, with composure, and addressed the courtroom, not as an enforcer, but as a reformer. "Every badge must be earned daily," she said, her voice even and purposeful, "not with rank or bravado, but with quiet integrity, not through intimidation, but through service. That is what the people deserve. That is what we must demand." No applause followed, only reflection. The gallery, once buzzing with misplaced allegiance, now sat still, absorbing a truth they hadn't expected to face. Outside the courthouse, the press surged forward in a blur of microphones and flashing lights. Reporters called her name, firing questions about corruption, justice, and departmental change. Camille paused on the steps, adjusted her suit jacket, and spoke not with a headline in mind, but with purpose. "The real work," she said softly, "begins now. Because this wasn't about catching a few bad actors. It was about uncovering a culture that allowed them to thrive." Her words were brief, but they echoed with clarity. Weeks later, Camille stood in front of a packed room of officers, some skeptical, others curious, all watching. It was her first internal training as Chief of Internal Affairs, and every chair in the precinct's largest conference room was filled. The walls, once adorned only with plaques and flags, now held mirrors of accountability. She didn't talk down. She didn't lecture. She told the truth about justice, about what she'd seen, and about what must come next. The room listened, not because they were forced to, but because something had shifted. Leadership had taken on a new face, one that saw them clearly, held them accountable, and believed in what the badge was supposed to represent. As the crowd dispersed, a young black officer, barely out of the academy, approached her slowly. He looked nervous at first, then stood straighter as he met her gaze. "You changed everything," he said, voice low but steady. Camille looked at him, warmth flickering behind her composed expression. "No," she replied, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Now, you protect it." And with that, she walked away, not toward a spotlight, but toward the work ahead. Because for Camille Hayes, justice wasn't a destination. It was a discipline. And now it belonged to all of them. In a courtroom carved from tradition and cloaked in ego, Camille Hayes reminded the world that true power doesn't need volume. It needs vision. She didn't lash out. She didn't seek applause. Instead, she stood firm in quiet conviction, letting arrogance crumble beneath its own weight. The men who once laughed at her now report to her, their smirks silenced not by fury, but by facts. And in that silence, justice didn't roar. It arrived, with clarity, with calm, with the kind of strength that reshapes systems. Have you ever witnessed power used the wrong way, or watched someone reclaim it with grace instead of revenge? Tell us your story in the comments. Let others know that dignity doesn't need to shout to be heard, and that real leadership doesn't demand respect, it earns it. If this story struck a chord, share it forward, because the moment we speak up, the silence ends, and change begins. More real stories, more real change, coming soon.